Hey guys, welcome back. It is the digital portrait drawing course. This is Kirk Nelson and we are now on lesson 3, which I'm calling Quick Portraits. And in this course I'll be discussing some shortcuts that's available with the tools in Photoshop to quickly develop what appears to be a hand-drawn portrait. In one scenario, it's simply a portrait that is traced over using the drawing tools. And in the second scenario, I will show you how to use some of the other tools like the filters and other things within Photoshop to generate a simulated hand-drawn appearance that actually produces a pretty good product. So let's go ahead and get going. Okay, so let's start here in Photoshop with our sketch paper off-white JPEG, which is our normal starting point. I've got the digital drawing workspace activated, and I'm going to open up the reference photos that we're using for the course, and I'm going to select this free image 5258148. I'm just going to go ahead and drag that right in and deposit it right on top of our canvas layer. I'm going to hit the check mark to say I'm going to keep it there. Now when you drag it in like that, it deposits it as a smart object. In this case, I want to go ahead and just rasterize that. So I'm going to go into Layer, Rasterize, Smart Object. And that converts it into a standard bitmap layer. Now before we go any further, let's go ahead and give a thank you to Marilla Schenk, who provided this photo to Stock Free Images. It's found on stockfreeimages.com. It's also available through the Reference Photos folder in the class files. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is remove the color from this and create it as a black and white image. Now there's several ways to do this in Photoshop. My preferred method is through Image Adjustments, Black and White. This gives a much cleaner result, I think, and a lot more control over the tones of grays according to each of the layers, because I like it to be a little brighter in the skin, I like the eyes to be nice and dark, something like that. I think that looks really good. Alright, now with this layer turned black and white, let's reduce the opacity a little bit, down to maybe about 50 or 60. Because the main point of this technique to start out with is actually drawing on top of the image. I'm going to add a couple of layers right in here. We'll call this one the shading layer and another one for the shape layer, just to do things a little quickly. And I will grab my 2B pencil, zoom in on that, and on the shape layer, let's go ahead and just start tracing around some of those lines that we see. Just a regular exercise in tracing. You're going to hit those major lines and just generate them by hand really quickly, just sort of tracing over. Okay, then once you've hit most of those major lines and you have your line work in about how you'd like it, you can go as deep with this as you want. I traditionally, when I use this technique to generate a quick portrait, will end up doing most of the work here, but I'm not going to continue much further here because I want to show you a more automated technique using some of the filters and other tools within Photoshop that can generate a good result too. You will get the best results or the most hand-drawn results if you actually do it by hand, but the rest of the course is actually about drawing the portraits, and so in this case I'm going to just show some further shortcuts here and not go through the entire process of tracing over the entire image. I do have my shading layer also in here that I will grab my pencil for, and for the shading layer what I really like to do is expand up that tip, get that tip nice and large, but reduce the opacity down to maybe a 10 and just really lightly start shading in these areas that you see the shading in the image itself, just to start to duplicate the shading that's in there. Okay, now at this point the portrait's starting to really come along. You can check your progress by toggling the visibility of the reference, and you can see it's starting to take shape. Now at this point you could either continue to follow down this road of tracing over it and mimicking the shading that's available visually, which there is some merit to that. You do learn a lot and it's a good exercise to go through. But just because this is a Photoshop course, I'd like to show you some alternative methods that will generate a quasi hand-drawn effect and a pretty nice image finally. And they are very quick and very easy to do. Now, I do caution, do not use these techniques as a substitute for actually drawing the portrait. Please use this course to learn how to generate these things by hand. I would be remiss if I left out the techniques showing the tools that are available to simulate a hand-drawn portrait within Photoshop. So I've got my drawing layers already set up here and my reference image available down here. First thing I'm going to do is duplicate this reference image. So I simply made a copy of it, and I'm going to set the mode to divide. All right, now if we turn off our drawing layers, you can see that's not generating too great of a result. Let's increase the opacity up on both of those actually. Okay, so with this top one that I just set to divide, let's run a Gaussian blur. That's under Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur. I'm going to set this up to about, let's see, just sort of continue the slider until you can see some of the details coming through. So about 31 pixels tends to work well for this image. Okay, now I'm going to make another copy of this background, of this original image layer, not the background, I'm sorry, simply by Alt or Option dragging it up on top of the other stack. And in this layer, I'm going to set this to use a Smart Blur. So Filter, Blur, Smart Blur. And what this is going to do is pull out a lot of those finer details of the image. I've got the quality set to high, the radius at 3, and the threshold I'm going to put up to about 50. Okay, now that does a good job of retaining the details we want, but eliminating like the pores in the skin or the finer details that we're not going to want to have as distractions. Okay, let's continue on. So I'm going to Filter, Filter Gallery now. All right, and I'm going to find in the sketch layer the graphic pen filter. Set it to right diagonal, and the stroke length is at 15, and the light dark balance I'm going to pull down to be about 20. Okay. All right, now that generates a type of shading effect by doing some slanted lines there, but those look really sharp, really small. So let's soften that a little bit by going to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur, and setting this to an angle of 45, which essentially matches that pen angle, and I'll set the distance way up so it looks more like an actual stroke that you would create with the pencil. Something around there. Now as we zoom out, that looks really blurry, doesn't it? I understand. We're going to set this now to a multiply blending mode. Pull the opacity down to about 50 to sort of fade it back a little. We don't really want that effect over all the details. I really like that effect mostly over some of the shading areas. So I'm going to hold down the Alt or the Option key and hit the mask button to remove that effect entirely. Grab my pencil again instead of our drawing pencil. I'm just going to use a large brush, large soft brush. Make sure the opacity is cranked up a little bit. And just paint that effect back in. Okay, once we get the shading to a point that we like, let's go ahead and turn on those drawing layers again. And that's creating a really nice drawn image there. Now I'm getting some hard edges along where we're doing the filtering on the layers there. So the thing to do is to grab all those and group them with Control or Command G into a single group. And let's go ahead and turn this group now to multiply just so that we can see that paper color showing through, and it removes all the white. I'm going to add a mask to the group, and again use that same large pencil, that large paintbrush with black ink to kind of just fade out those hard edges that are on the tops and the bottoms. And if some of the spots seem a little hot, you can use the same idea. There. And just as a final tweak to it, it's always good to add a curves adjustment layer and use this to deal with any contrast issues that you'd like to see dealt with here. I think some of the black there is a little too black, so I'm going to take this left point and pull it up a little, and then grab a middle point and pull it down to increase some of the contrast of the midtones. Alright, and then that's our quick portrait done in Photoshop. Okay guys, that's the end of lesson 3 for quick portraits. Thanks for watching. I hope that's something useful that you may be able to use. And I really hope you'll join me for lesson 4, where we will talk about the basic head proportions and really get our hands wet in developing a drawing of a human portrait.